Blessings, good evening to everybody. Very pleasant summer's evening, or early summer, late spring evening. Warm, no wind, very suitable for practicing indoors or outdoors, doing walking meditation. It's also being Tuesday night, we have a few questions to answer. And first question or request is, can you speak about the Buddhist nun Upasika Kee, Nanayon? There's a number of very well-known Buddhist nuns in Thailand, or who have lived in Thailand, and developed a very good reputation as well-practiced and well-realized nuns. Mechi Gao is another. Upasika Kee lived in the last century. When I first went to Wat Pah Nanachat in the early 1980s, they had a very small library, not many books, not many Dhamma books in those days. But they did have a few books and even a few English translations of Upasika Kee's teachings on meditation, and I found them very helpful. I used to read them alternating with teachings from Ajahn Chah, and as I was learning Thai, I would read Ajahn Chah and translate his books, and then I would also read Upasika Kee's books. So she was born, I think 1901, died a few years before I went to Thailand, so the late 1970s. She was about 77, 78 when she died. And she lived most of her life in Ratburi, or Rajapuri province, which is a couple of hours' drive west of Bangkok towards Burma, so not northeast Thailand. One of the reasons I liked her teaching is very similar to the forest tradition of Ajahn Mun, the way she talked about Dhamma from her meditative experience and also her lifestyle, which supported her meditation. Most forest monks found her teachings and her lifestyle very inspiring, just in the same way as the forest Ajahns. Her main teachers were Ajahn Buddhadasa and some other nuns who I don't know the name of, but she had a few teachers, but she's brought up in a family with great faith in Buddhism and the Buddhist teachings. Her mother was a devotee and would go to the monastery every full moon, new moon, half moon day and keep the 8 precepts, listen to Dhamma, chant, meditate, and would regularly put food in the bowls of Buddhist monks who would come past the house every morning at dawn. So that was the environment she was brought up in, and from a very early age she showed both her faith in Buddhism and also her leadership qualities. And she, at the age of about 6, I believe, she started collecting her pocket money, and instead of buying sweets, which is what kids in those days might have spent it on, she would buy treats or rice and keep it and put it in the bowls of the monks who would come round on Bindabata. So that was from her own intention, her own faith, which is very unusual. Kids today, would they be spending their pocket money on buying food to put in the bowls of Buddhist monks? They'd probably be saving for their next phone or tablet or whatever. So she was quite unusual in that sense, and she even later, when she was about 10 or 11, she went and started helping her relatives sell things in the marketplace. And again, she earned a bit of money, and she would put that back into buying foodstuffs and rice and things to offer to monks. And she showed an aptitude for selling. She was good at it. She was good with handling goods, money, understanding about how to make a profit from selling stuff. She had good way of with other people, customers. So her family thought she had a great future as a saleswoman selling stuff. But she never had that intention as a career. It was more just as a means to make money to support the family and her practice. And her real love was Buddhism. So again, from an early age, she also loved to read Buddhist books, the texts, particularly like the Dhammapada and the verses of kind of poetry from the Arahants in the time of the Buddha, and also Buddhist poetry from her era. So being brought up, in a time pre-internet, even printed books were very rare, but one of the main books that the books that she could get hold of were Buddhist books from temples, the libraries in temples, and she loved to read and even started composing Buddhist poetry, though she said she wasn't very good at it, but it was an expression of her faith. She would learn verses herself and also try and compose. And later, when she was an adult, she'd actually sometimes go and visit Ajahn Buddhadasa in southern Thailand, and Ratburi province is sort of on the way to southern Thailand. And she saw him as her meditation teacher, and also she would ask him how to compose poetry and get advice, because she said she wasn't good at it. And she'd even send him poetry, and the good stuff he would publish, because he was publishing Dhamma journals in, say, the 1940s and 50s, a long time ago now. And she also started practicing keeping the 8 precepts regularly, following her mother. So, in her teens, when other girls were thinking probably about boys and music and makeup and clothes and all of that kind of stuff, she was keeping the 8 precepts. And one of her relatives took her to a festival, which was, often the way young people would go out on the town, go to a festival where there was music and food and meet other young people. And she went and she didn't like it. She said, I keep the 8 precepts, this is not the right place for me, because I keep the 8 precepts, you don't indulge in music, entertainments, wear makeup and so on. So she went straight home. And so she got a reputation as one who was into the Dhamma and not really into the worldly things. And she also stayed away from men, not interested in dating. She wanted to be celibate, keep the 8 precepts and focus on the practice of Dhamma. Even to the point when her mum got pregnant, she just didn't want to have anything to do with her mum, not because she didn't love her mum, she did, but the idea of pregnancy and getting pregnant, she didn't want to have anything to do with it. And when her mum was giving birth, she actually fled to the neighbour's house for a couple of days. And she's also disappointed. There was a practice in Thailand in the old days when a woman had given birth, they would, after she'd given birth, they would roast her body, they'd build a fire in the bedroom for 3 days and heat her body. It was a custom to kind of dry the body out, replenish it, but I don't think it was very healthy, and certainly she was horrified by this practice that her mother had to go through. So she stayed away until it was over. She had no intention of getting married, getting pregnant. She wanted to practice the Dhamma. And luckily her mum was sympathetic because her mother had great faith. So she also encouraged her. And she kept up her job in the market, earning money. Kids in those days left school quite early. So she would go and earn some money for the family because she took her responsibility to help her parents, and as they got older, to look after them very seriously. And so she was a breadwinner for the family, and she was good at it. She was good at earning money. But she said she wouldn't do it. She wasn't just into earning money for the sake of it. She didn't just want to get rich. It was more to help the family. So when she had, there were periods of time when she had made enough money, and she would take time off and go and stay in local monasteries. There was one called Wat Mahatat, not the famous Wat Mahatat in Bangkok, but a local one, Tarapburi. There's another mountain monastery called Khao Wang, where Ajahn Chah actually visited, and some of his monks used to go and stay. She would stay there, and she'd take friends and relatives to introduce them to the Dhamma and encourage them to practice keeping precepts, learning meditation, learning chanting. And often they would go with her and she'd say, we're going to stay for a week, like do a retreat for a week, and they'd only last a few days, go home, but she would stay the full time because she had the strongest faith. And she learned to meditate. She said one of her first really deep, profound experiences with meditation was when she was introduced to the practice of meditating all night long, what we call Nesaji, which is one of the Tudonga practices of monks, but obviously lay people can practice meditation through the night as well. And she was surprised that she, putting effort into her meditation the very first time she practiced overnight, not resting, not sleeping, just meditating, she found by about midnight, 1 a.m., her mind was very bright. Entered samadhi, she wasn't sleepy, she wasn't distracted, and she could sit all night with a very bright, lucid state of mind in samadhi. So that was a great revelation to her and a great moment of inspiration, and that led her to practice in that way regularly after that. And she would just take time off when she could to go and stay in monasteries, keep precepts, meditate, just quietly learning by herself. She received teaching from teachers, but then she would just practice for herself, improving her meditation. She said one time, another occasion, she had a deep insight into the deluding nature of day and night. She said most human beings, they just naturally follow the cycle of day and night. When it's light, you get up, you work, you do activities during the daylight. Then at night, in those days there's a lot less electricity, people used candles. So nighttime was a much more limiting time for human beings, and they tend to rest, not do much. And they're just stuck in that cycle of daytime active, nighttime resting, sleeping, and also the perceptions of darkness and light, and how we just automatically respond to those perceptions. When it's light time, you get up, you do things. When it's night time, you stop. But actually, it doesn't have to be that way. And because she was experiencing the bright mind of samadhi, she wasn't attaching so much to day and night in the normal way. So she said that was a big insight into just seeing the timeless nature of the peaceful mind. When you're mindful, contemplating Dhamma, that can be in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night, and that people are bound by the cycles of time, she said. That's one insight she recounted later. Another thing I remember when I was a young monk reading, she talked about how she would take the time to go and stay in the charnel ground. It's a practice that most people never wanted to do because they're scared of ghosts and death. But monks would do it, and she wanted to practice in the same way as monks. So she made a determination to go and stay in a charnel ground where they had regularly had cremations for a week. And she took a friend, and the friend quickly wilted and disappeared, but she stayed. And she said, she's so scared of ghosts and death, dead bodies, and this charnel ground even had bones just lying on the ground in it, from people who didn't have relatives. Maybe they were cremated there and their bones were not collected. So she stayed I think about 30 or 40 meters away from the fireplace where they would cremate bodies in funerals, because she didn't want to be too near it at first. She was so scared. And each night she was there, she'd move a little bit closer, build up her courage, be patient with the fear, until the last night she was camping and meditating right on the spot where they would burn the bodies. And she said that turned out to be the full moon night. And so at some point during the night, the full moon came out from the clouds and lit up the charnel ground, and she could see the whiteness of the bones. So she said that was very confronting, the fear of ghosts, fear of death. But then because it was clear and the night sky was clear, she was contemplating just, well, what's there to be afraid of? What is there to fear in a bone? The leg bone or the rib cage or the skull of a human being. Why is that fearful? It's only our perception, because we associate it with death, that fear comes up. But a bone itself just sitting on the ground is not anything to be afraid of. So she overcome a lot of her fear of death and the attraction to the body and the identification with the body during that period, meditating like that. So she was quite unique. Most monks didn't want to do that, let alone laymen, lay women. So she was very bold in her practice, and this was one of her leadership skills coming through. She would keep practicing when other people would give up. But all the time through her 20s and 30s, she had the aspiration to become a nun, live in a monastery full-time, but she still had a sense of duty to look after her parents, and so she would alternate between living in monasteries and then earning money for the family, but also teaching her parents. She'd get them to come to the monastery and listen to Dhamma, practice meditation, and she felt that was the best way to repay her parents. And particularly her father, when he came ill, she got him practicing meditation every day, and that helped him to get through his illness, and he recovered. So he really gained strong faith from her encouragement and learnt to meditate up until the time he died. And so he was very grateful to his own daughter for helping him through that, and the mother also. But when they died, then she felt she was now free to devote herself to the Dhamma practice completely. So at the age of about 44, she went to stay on this hill in Ratburi called Khao Suan Luang, which became the place, her monastery or her hermitage that she started. And it was it was jungle, and very, very quiet, and very remote, and very, no facilities. It was just jungle. It was just a hillside. But it was near her relatives. Some of her relatives on her mother's side had land there. So there was a connection, and she knew the hill. So she decided to set up a kuti, build a very simple little hut, and meditate there. And very quickly her friends, who already knew her as a Dhamma practitioner, wanted to come and practice with her. So she started a small nuns community with very little financial or material support, but she had some savings which helped. So they could cook food, build very simple huts, and there was very little. There was no electricity, no running water. They had to haul water, bathe in the pond, and just live very simply, just like forest monks. And this earned her a lot of respect. People could see she was very determined to practice and wasn't seeking fame or fortune or wealth or anything, just to practice the Dhamma. And she always said, I'm here to practice for the end of dukkha, the end of suffering. So she called the monastery Nirodharam, the place of cessation, or the forest of cessation. She said, that's what I'm practicing for. And she was very kind to the nuns who started to live and train with her. She was a teacher, and she would give them instruction, lead them in meditation. They'd just come together once a week, so much of the time they're doing practice in seclusion on their own, but they'd come together on the full moon, new moon and half moon nights and meditate, chant together, and she would instruct them. They'd do work together, and she would teach them to practice, the 4 foundations of mindfulness through the day. So if they had a work period, a chores period, they'd do it practicing mindfulness, whether it's cleaning up, setting up something, building a kuti. They would do it all themselves. So it's just women working, practicing together. And she said there's always one in a group. If you've got a group of people, men or women, there'll always be one who just can't stop talking, not very mindful. And they'd work, and she wouldn't engage in much talking. She was always known to be quite quiet, restrained. She said she was practicing sense restraint, indriya samvara. So the nuns would follow her, but there'd always be somebody who'd talk a lot, wouldn't stop talking. And sooner or later, one of the other nuns would sort of break and start talking as well. And at that point, she'd just tell them or remind them, say, we've got one crazy person in the group, the one who talks all the time. No need to have 2 crazy people, so no need to engage with her, the one who's talking too much. Just let her talk, but don't engage with her. That was one of the comments people said. She was quite encouraging of just mindfully, silently doing your practice through the day, eating, working, meditating. She'd do a lot of walking meditation, and she lived very frugally because they only had a small amount of financial support and money. Gradually her reputation grew as a teacher, so people came from Bangkok and around to support and want to practice and join in there. But many people found it hard to live there. It was so ascetic, so little comfort, and so quiet. A lot of people found it just too remote. They were sort of scared or found it difficult to be there. Nevertheless, the community continued to grow, and she became a very well-respected teacher. And eventually, some people who I met later, after she died, they got her a tape recorder in her later years, say in the 1960s. They got a tape recorder so that they could start taping her talks, and that's where the books have come from. And then Jeff Tanisaro has translated some of her talks into English, and some others have as well. So her teachings are available on the internet nowadays. But as she got older, she also had a lot of health issues. She had a terrible back pain. Maybe it was a slip disc or something, but she never got treatment for it. She just quietly put up with it. And so her closest friends knew she was in pain. She had some other illness issues, but health issues, but she never sought help, and she never talked about it. Never made a big deal out of it. She was always encouraging people to practice and be mindful of whatever their experience was, whether they had pain or pleasure, to live simply. And she was always a good example. She used to have a little coconut, half a coconut, which she used for eating out of and for scooping water when she bathed. That was how frugal she was. And they lived very simply, and the food they had was very simple kind of food. She became a vegetarian very young age, because in many societies, meat is always considered a luxury, of the food of the rich, and encourages that sense of sensuality. Always trying to make nice meat dishes, whether it's chicken or pork or fish. She said we can live as vegetarians and simplify things. So she was a vegetarian for most of her life. And they said she was very compassionate. She looked after sick nuns and taught people and helped them in whatever way she could. But she's also wise, and she would give teachings and teach people to reflect on what they were doing, not to just do things blindly or blindly attached to the rituals. Like she said, we don't need to have a lot of rituals in the practice. So they didn't have a lot of ceremonies or ritual there, which you often find in temples and monasteries. She'd always encourage people to practice. And she'd encourage people not to get stuck in kind of extreme views. So one thing that came to mind thinking about her life with the COVID is that there was a cholera outbreak in Thailand in the 1950s or 60s. A lot of people dying, and the government sent people around to give the vaccination to everyone. And they came to the monastery, and some of the nuns were being very kind of gung-ho and saying, no, we're not going to get vaccinated because we're just going to practice and rely on the Dhamma. And everyone was saying, you might die, because the cholera was killing people. It was a very serious outbreak. And she said, we're not crazy here, we're not extremists. Get your vaccination so that you can carry on practicing, keep your body healthy. Perhaps that's pertinent to this day and age, I don't know. So she was always encouraging the nuns to think. Don't just believe something, don't just hold to a view, cling to a view. Think about what you're doing, think about the views that you hold, look at what is really conducive to the practice of Dhamma. And of course, to encourage them to contemplate to see the impermanence of the body, the mental state, feelings, to see the lack of self. That was one of the flavors of her teachings, is to teach people to see and experience non-self, or anatta. And she would say, whatever you realize in the Dhamma, there's no person who realizes that, whether it's sila or samadhi or insight, wisdom. There's no one who owns that insight. It's just a natural arising when the conditions are correct, the practice, the factors of the path and the practice have been developed, then insight arises, but there's no one who owns the insight. She said there was one period during her early years where she was really caught into a lot of desire for results in the practice, and she would sit and meditate for many hours, and sometimes sit to the point where she could hardly move because she'd been sitting for so long. But she said there was always a little bit of this craving, seeking results there, and that after many weeks, months, years of that, she noticed this is actually an obstacle in the practice. To have craving for results stops your mind letting go, stops your mind entering samadhi, stops your mind seeing the Dhamma as Dhamma. She had this realization one day when she'd been sitting for so long she could hardly move, and she just had some kind of realization where she thought, the real problem is this, my desire for results is blocking me. I'm not getting peaceful, I'm not seeing through my own attachment here. I need to change my attitude. And she started to get up, and it was difficult because she was in pain from the sitting posture. And she said at that moment she had this kind of flip in her mind, and she suddenly saw her mind almost like as a separate thing from the body. And that seemed to happen quite naturally because she'd given up this desire for results. It dropped away at that moment, and then she saw her own mind, and her mind became very bright, radiant with a lot of joy and pleasure from the Dhamma. And she said from that moment on she had a whole new attitude towards her practice, where she realized it's not about craving results, it has to come through mindfulness, a refinement of mindfulness and letting go. And she said her samadhi improved from that day on, and she regularly would experience periods of samadhi, very deep samadhi, and she would often quote the Buddha's teaching about how when the mind is peaceful, it's like the moon coming out from the clouds on a full moon night. The brightness of the moon is like the brightness of the mind that is peaceful, and mindfulness is established. So she went on practicing and teaching as she got older, because she got more sick and had these back problems. Even though she didn't tell anyone, she became a little bit less active, and she also started to go blind. So you'll see pictures of her with these dark glasses on because she was going blind. But it didn't stop her practicing. She was still practicing her mindfulness, living very restrained, secluded life, very frugal, but teaching a bit less formally. And she encouraged her nuns to learn to practice for themselves. So she had an eye on the future. And in the 1970s, when she was in her 70s, she had the nuns make a kind of shrine or sarcophagus, kind of a place where her body would be interred before she died. She gave them instructions where to build it in front of the hall, a kind of I think it was made of granite maybe, so granite designed coffin that would be the place where her body would be laid to rest after she died. So she was seeing that every day, designing it for herself, her own body. So she must have been quite at peace with the thought of death. And she died in, I think, 1978, but left a very large number of very devoted disciples, nuns, but also monks would visit her. Even Ajahn Mahabua visited her monastery and recognized her as a very great meditator and teacher, praised her, and she, like with other monks, when he came to visit, she just made sure he was looked after, had a drink, had a place to sit. He didn't go to stay the night, but he was looking at the place, and he met her, but then she quickly disappeared. She didn't want to sit and chat, and she said that's for people who just want to get attached to teachers, sit around chatting with monks, for nuns to chat around with monks. She didn't encourage that. She went away to do her own meditation. So she left him there, having shown respect. And that's how she would relate to the Sangha of monks. When they came to visit, she'd just briefly pay respects, meet them, make sure they were looked after, and then separate and not spend time with them. She did visit Ajahn Buddhadasa on a number of occasions, and she had great respect for him, and he had great respect for her. Like Ajahn Mahabua, he praised her as a very sincere, genuine practitioner, and much loved by her students to this day. There's still a few people around who can remember her. So another reminder that practicing the Dhamma is not limited by gender or age or race. It's really up to those who have faith to put their effort into the practice, and they can get good results. So if you get the chance, maybe Google her name, Upasika Kee Nanayon, from Ratpuri, Thailand, and her Dhamma talks are very inspiring, very to the point Dhamma talks. There's another question. How do we deal with self-hatred and disappointment? I don't know if anyone's studied this, but it seems to be a growing or an increasing problem in society, this self-hatred, aversion, clinging to an idea of self, and then this self that has made mistakes or bad things have happened or been unable to fulfill one's ambitions or dreams, and then becoming very caught up with aversion and disappointment. So obviously now we know there's a lot of diagnosed depression in society, a lot of people with anger issues, depression, and so on. So as I say, I'm not sure whether it's more common than 50 or 100 years ago. It wasn't unknown in the past, but it seems to be a more modern thing. And what conditions self-hatred? Well, partly it's you want something and you don't get it. So perhaps nowadays we want more, or we have more expectations of life. We expect things to go our way. Perhaps we're less patient with the world. We have more expectations of getting what we want, whether it's fame, fortune, wealth, different kinds of pleasures and happiness that we seek. And so when we don't get them, we flip into anger and blame ourselves. So any form of aversion, hatred, ill will is countered by metta, goodwill, unconditional love, and karuna, compassion. So the short answer is, well, we need to develop more metta, more goodwill and compassion for ourselves as well as other people to counter this tendency of always finding fault with ourselves, picking up on what's wrong, what went wrong in the past, what's going wrong now, what may go wrong in the future. It's the opposite, or the antidote to that is developing goodwill. So usually our teachers give us the idea from parents, the normal parental love for their offspring, for their child, is one of unconditional love, at least up to a point, where mums and dads, they accept their children, whatever. Your child makes a mistake, you still love them, you still accept them. We need to develop that same kind of goodwill for ourselves if we're tending towards self-hatred and self-harm or aversion. We have to see the innate humanity in ourselves and develop this quality of tolerance, kindness, forgiveness for mistakes that are being made or have been made, and see that, develop that understanding that life is made up of mistakes and learning from failures and mistakes. I always talk about kids learning to walk, because you think when a kid learns to walk, they fall down hundreds of times before they can stand up and walk properly. And pretty much everything in life, whether it's Dhamma practice, study, work, hobbies, sports, musical instruments, whatever, until you get good at something, you're going to have to keep failing and making mistakes and being disappointed, but then you also have to learn how to pick yourself up. And it's part of life, isn't it? It's part of the life skills we have to learn as human beings, is how to move on from things that go wrong. Even sometimes when very unpleasant, you might say unnecessary or tragic things happen, we really have to learn how to move on, pick ourselves up and move on. And you get the strength to do that from developing goodwill, metta and karuna, compassion, the wish for you as a person to improve and to find happiness and get beyond your suffering, just as we also develop that for others around us. And so the Buddha encouraged us to practice this every day, even before you're getting angry or caught into self-hatred and disappointments of life. Develop goodwill, compassion for yourself and for others as a regular meditation, as an attitude, a skillful attitude in daily life. And you'll find if you're doing that, then certainly you'll find your mind settles down when you come to meditate. Your mind becomes more peaceful more easily when you're practicing metta and karuna. Your relations with other people tend to improve, and then your relation to yourself tends to improve, because you're nurturing it in the correct way. And it won't stop you making mistakes and failures and losing things, you losing the plot or whatever sometimes, but it cushions the blow of those things and helps you to get back up again so that you can continue to learn and grow from life and move on. And we have to learn how to heal our mind just as we heal the body when we're injured. You have to go through periods. So you break your leg, where you have to put your leg in plaster and wait for it to heal, and then you're free from that broken leg and you can carry on using your legs to do things. Or if you have a wound, you have to treat it, clean it, bandage it, whatever, until gradually it heals. And our mind's the same. If you get a wound on your hand, you don't keep making the wound worse, do you? You try to care for it, improve it. If you get a broken leg, you don't keep walking on the leg and make it worse. You put it in plaster and you may have to rest a lot until you can walk again. Our mind's the same. If you are experiencing a lot of aversion, disappointment, depression, you have to put effort into developing goodwill and be very patient and tolerant with your mind, rather than making it worse by self-harm or just developing a very negative attitude to yourself, always picking on your faults and developing a negative attitude to the world as well. That's only going to make things worse. So we have to make the effort to bring up goodwill. Spend time with people who have goodwill and compassion. That's a good one. If you have teachers, good friends, that helps to uplift us. And if there's no one immediately available, you have to find the goodwill in your own mind and associate with that, and you develop the goodwill as a meditation, as an attitude through your day. So I'm only just touching on this subject, but you have to keep doing this, and you'll find good results can come. The last question today is, please can you advise how to deal with not being able to sleep at night? There's so many reasons why people can't sleep at night. Yesterday we made a bonfire in the forest because we were tidying up around a kuti, and I inhaled too much smoke. So last night I was coughing all night, couldn't sleep. Couldn't blame anyone but myself for standing too close to the fire. So sometimes it's health issues, you can't sleep at night. You just have to accept that and do the best you can. Sometimes it's worry, isn't it? It's like what keeps us awake at night is worries. So we have to work with that. As we know, when you can't sleep at night, often the first reaction you wake up too quickly, after an hour or something, or you can't get to sleep in the first place. You tend to worry about not being able to sleep, and you compound the whole thing. So one of the best preparations for sleep is meditation. Meditate before you go to sleep at night. Do that regularly. Get into a good habit. Ajahn Chah used to say, go to sleep when you're not feeling sleepy. Which is an unusual thing to say, but what he meant was clear your mind, so when you go to sleep, you're mindful till the moment you fall asleep. You'll tend to sleep well and just enough. You could also do some metta meditation before you go to sleep, because if you are one who's anxious, worried, there's a problem in your life that keeps coming up, well, this will help to soothe the mind, calm you down. You could do breath meditation, you could do loving kindness meditation. This will help at least prepare your mind, put it in a good, wholesome state before you fall asleep. And it's funny, isn't it? When people are sitting meditation in a hall or in a retreat, sleepiness is a huge problem. So why not try it before you go to sleep? Or if you wake up in the middle of the night and you feel you haven't slept enough, do some meditation. Follow the breathing, count the breaths. Maybe you'll fall asleep, because people are always falling asleep in the meditation period. Maybe it'll work then and you'll get the sleep that you want. But at the very least, try not to get caught into worries about not having enough sleep, so the next day I'll be tired. Quite often our body is its own self-regulator, so sometimes not being able to sleep is a sign that we actually have had enough sleep. There's always that possibility. Or when the time comes and you're really tired, well, maybe you'll sleep quite naturally. So try to set aside the worries. Just accept the situation. Use a skillful way to bring up mindfulness. Go to the breath, bring up loving kindness. And wait and see. If all fails, just get up and do something good for a while. And then try and sleep later. That's another thing you can do. Get up and meditate. Listen to a Dhamma talk. Again, when monks give Dhamma talks, quite often people are sitting there nodding, falling asleep. So you turn a Dhamma talk on while you're having trouble with sleepless nights, and maybe it will help you sleep. You have to try a few things, but try not to get into a habit of worrying or getting anxious about not sleeping. And then also, whatever the issue is that's bothering you, try to bring yourself to some resolution to say, well, this is not something that will be improved or helped by worrying. And worrying doesn't help anyone. Anxiety doesn't solve problems. It just makes them worse. So try and recognize that. So when it comes up, you're giving yourself the right instructions. You say, it's okay, let it go, let it be. The worries are not going to help anything here. You have to teach yourself to set them aside. The future is unknown. You can only imagine the future. You don't really know what will happen. And so you teach yourself that, to let go of the worry and the anxiety. Worries about the past, things that have already happened, they've already passed by. You can't change the past. So if you've had you've been through a difficult situation or had a difficult time, you're in a relationship or at work or health issues, teach yourself to worry about it is just adding to the pressures of life, adding to your suffering. If it's already happened, you can't change that. You can learn from it, but then move on. If it hasn't happened yet because you're worrying about the future, well, teach yourself to come back to the present moment, enjoy the present moment. So relax with the breathing or the meditation on loving kindness until you fall asleep. If you're still not falling asleep, listen to some Dhamma, maybe gain some useful insights and knowledge from a Dhamma talk while you're not able to sleep. Use your time well, do something. Depends on the person, doesn't it? Ajahn Chah used to say, if somebody is an easy sleeper, they're with merit. They just fall asleep easily, and you get those people, they can sleep in a car, sleep when they're meditating, anytime they've got a bit of free time, they can just fall asleep. He used to say, those people have a lot of merit. They don't have any problems with sleepiness. But if you're not like that, if you're one who's always a bit hyper or anxious, well, just try and bring up some wholesome reflections, just accept it. Maybe it's to do with your body, maybe it's to do with your mental states. Just learn from it. And you may find over time, you can learn to manage with it. Maybe when you get older, you sleep less anyway. Sometimes with age, we sleep less. But try and learn from your experience, and you may find there are things you can do to improve it. So that's the end of the questions tonight. Hope there's been something useful for you in all of that. But anyway, we'll wish you well, and may the blessings of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha guide you and protect you.